Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Reverend Abby, and I use she, her, hers.
In this episode, we'll discuss the fourth Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 12 or Proper 7, which this year falls on June 20th. One content notification for this episode is that towards the end of our deep dive, we do talk briefly about police brutality and violence against especially Indigenous and Black protesters.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
Today for our deep dive, we have Reverend Abby Mohop, who is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA, having served urban, suburban, and rural congregations and communities before starting a PhD in religion, culture, and ecology at Drew University. She's on staff at Green Faith and one of the moderators of Fossil Free PCUSA, which works on climate change in the PCUSA, as well as an artist who sometimes posts on Instagram at Fea Theology, F-E-A Theology. Welcome, Abby. It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So you do a lot of work with climate and environmental justice, particularly from a faith perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, so I do my work as a person of faith and as a faith leader around climate and environmental justice in a couple of different worlds. One is as an academic through my PhD, and my dissertation work is on how the Presbyterian Church has responded to climate change through divestment from fossil fuels and other social movements. And then I also, my paid gig is as the Director of Education and Training at Green Faith, which is an international interfaith environmental nonprofit. Train and equip and inspire people of faith all over the world to respond to environmental and climate injustice. And then I get to hang out with people of faith, helping people think creatively through art and music and building gardens and just like connecting how we as people of faith connect to the places that we call home and love the land and creative energy that God gives us. And that's a little bit about living into personal practices and lifestyle changes that are rooted in climate justice.
Sure.
Nice.
So, was there any moment in particular in your life that led you toward this work?
Yeah.
Or
I have a real distinct memory of, so I grew up in Northern Illinois, and...
Hey, me too.
Where did you grow up in Northern Illinois?
Rockford in DeKalb.
That's insane, because I also grew up in Rockford. So, childhood in Northern Illinois, in Rockford, right? It's like snowing, and have this like embedded memory of my dad sending us in our elementary school age to like shovel the snow on the driveway. And my dad was shoveling a pathway from our house to the compost pile in the snow.
Sure.
And just like for me, it was this real tangible reminder that you take care of the earth even if it's inconvenient, that you like live out the practices that make the earth a better place all the time, year round, in every moment. And that is one of the things in my life that I take into the work now, that when it feels uncomfortable or inconvenient to say something about climate change or environmental injustice, I often come back to this like, oh, my dad taught us to do this even when it didn't feel great, or it would be easier to just not compost for the winter.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's a real distinct moment for me. And then as a person of faith, going to summer camp and then really feeling called to seminary soon, like right after I finished my undergrad degree, and just feeling like there's nothing else that I could do or think about or study, that was what I felt called to, and where I felt most connected to God and other people.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And impressive, because I didn't know about composting until I lived in Slovakia after I graduated college and before I went to seminary. I think that was the first time I really knew anything about composting, and even then it was just that was what my host family did.
Yeah. I asked my mom about this pretty recently, like, why did we compost? Why were we so into recycling? And she talked about like how her mother, who was connected to the Depression in the U.S., it was important to her to like as conservative of resources as possible, and so she passed that on to her, my mother, and it never occurred to my mom that she wouldn't teach us how to do that either. And my dad was in, right? Like he was like, this is important. And so I remember going to college and people being like, what's this composting thing? And I was like, this is the coolest. And then, and I love it so much. And then I remember going to this conference. This is like a real deep dive into how much I love composting. But going to this conference with Presbyterians for Earth Care, and their musicians started talking about how compost is a great metaphor for the resurrection of Jesus. And I was like, yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That life comes from death, and it's got to go deep down into the darkness, and that darkness creates more life, and that's it. If you want to understand the resurrection of Jesus, you got to understand compost.
I think we just found our episode tagline.
I think so. Also, I think my nerdery in this conversation might be compost.
Excellent.
That is fair. And you are not limited to just one.
Hooray!
Yeah. Also, I would say that, the whole, maybe not the resurrection part, but like the whole process of Jesus getting to the resurrection probably smelled about as bad.
Yeah, exactly. Just like real smelly and gross and like not pretty, and you don't really want to think about the process, but like you cannot have a good garden if you're not composting. I mean, I guess you can, but it's like more life-giving if you have compost. You need a little death.
Yeah, and you can't come back to life if you're not dead first.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
True.
So on that happy note, Abby, so climate change has been an ongoing process, and we've known about it for quite a while, like as in well before any of us were born. But from what I understand, it sounds like we, and by we I mean America and possibly the world, could have been making small changes all along, and we would be at a reasonable place by now. But instead, we just kept pushing and pushing and pushing and refusing to make any changes, right? Mm-hmm. Is that how that works?
Yeah. So, when you talk about how we've known about climate change for a long time, we've known about climate change since the 1800s. The early climate scientists who weren't even like climate scientists did the first computations about carbon emissions and burning fossil fuels, and how the world would get hotter because of that. Did those first computations by hand in the 19th century. And so that's how long we've known. And the fossil fuel industry, as it was really setting up shop based in the U.S., was really undergirded by Protestant theology of having dominion over the earth and taking everything that you need, and that God is giving us all of creation to do whatever we want with. So the fossil fuel industry is deeply embedded in the United States, deeply embedded in Protestant theology, and particularly white Protestant theology. And that kind of connected into capitalism, and there were like the industry knew the more that we, and continues to know, that the more that we create fossil fuels, and the more we burn it, the hotter we're going to get. And so in the 1980s, so after the industry had kind of globalized, it was kind of this like watershed moment where scientists and activists went to the U.S. Congress and to stop. And so it was in the 70s and the 80s, and basically the fossil fuel industry said, no, we need to make more money. And kind of around the same time, like Jimmy Carter, as the president of the United States, was adding solar panels, and then Ronald Reagan came in and took the solar panels down, and we really like disconnected responding to climate change. Like we just put climate change and fossil fuels only connected to Protestant theologies of capitalism and expansion and dominion, instead of connecting it to happy frugality and simplicity and loving our neighbor and loving the planet and loving God, right? Kind of set up that cultural dichotomy and saying like this is how we think about climate, which really meant that people gave up a culture, or like didn't sign on to a culture of like what you have and composting and recycling. Recycling still doesn't have the like cultural, like isn't in our zeitgeist the way that it is in other places of the world.
Right.
And
my apartment complex doesn't recycle, so I have to bring it to my friend's house and add it to theirs.
Yeah, my apartment complex may or may not recycle. Like, they have recycling bins, but do they actually recycle? We don't know. But it also, doesn't make sense financially to recycle globally. So, so what you really asked me is, we could have been making small changes all along, but we kept procrastinating. We believed that actually it wasn't ever that bad, and that the fossil fuel industry put a lot of money into false campaigns that said that fossil fuels aren't that bad.
Oh, yes, because, the scientists who say that climate change is bad are making tons of money, and that's why they're all driving Volvos.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah.
Volvos that are 20 years old and crappy, right? And basically the fossil fuel industry, won that cultural narrative. And it's only been since the, mid to late 90s that churches have begun to push back and use their moral authority to say, actually, we have to respond to climate from that part of our responsibility as people of faith is to conserve the planet. And, though of course there's been strains that have been doing it all along, right? And I think, the other thing I just want to say about this too is that, of course, as human, particularly the United States, where we've really had all of the advantages of the fossil fuel industry, and up until a few years ago, not a lot of the problems related to climate change. Of course, we procrastinated because I think there's something about the condition where we're not that bad yet. We don't have to do anything yet. It's not time yet. The same reasons why I put off doing my math homework in high school because I hated it and it was painful, right? So we're just I'll buy a better car next year. It's fine. I have some time. Or I'll vote somebody else into office later. I don't want people to think that I'm a crazy hippie because I'm voting for whoever. And we're really now at a place, depending on which scientists you ask, they either say we're past the point of no return or we're almost to the point of no return.
Mm-hmm.
And so our individual actions around climate and environmental injustice, they're worth taking on still because they change us and they instill in us a love of the planet and a love of God and a love of other people. But individual action actually doesn't shift climate change more. We've really missed that boat.
Yeah, I've started to talk about things like recycling in particular as spiritual practices.
That's
more
right.
than a practical thing that will save the world.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
It's especially interesting because, we had the national attitude of mend and make do and of use what you have and all that during World War II. It was a huge part of the cultural zeitgeist, and people took pride in it, and especially after the Depression. And the fact that got turned around probably in the 50s to spend more and make more and have more is a big part, I think, of what changed our cultural attitude about that. And I kind of hate to say this, but now that you're talking about it in this way, I can also see a parallel between the climate change attitudes of either we have dominion and therefore it's our right versus love thy neighbor, and how America reacted to the pandemic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's exactly right. And this is what I'm saying about our human condition, to be wait, hold on, let me get mine instead of let me take care of the collective.
Yeah, and we have a Presbyterian and 2 Lutherans on this podcast, so we are exactly who should be talking about how much humanity sucks. Yeah.
Sometimes I just am in Presbyterian worlds, we talk about that as total depravity. We really suck. And sometimes people are well, kind of push back at me and be how can you really believe that? I'm well, let me tell you about climate change or the pandemic.
Have you seen the climate lately?
Or, I don't know, anti-Black racism. Yeah, we're terrible. Can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's real.
For what it's worth, the pop culture reference for how I explain Lutheran attitudes on that is the bit from 10 Things I Hate About You, where the one guy says, we're screwed, and the other guy says, no, have a more positive attitude, and he says, we're screwed!
Yeah.
And that's the Lutheran. Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
I love it. Now I'm going to go watch that movie.
I love that movie.
I'm going to watch it again. I haven't watched that in a long time.
Yeah.
I miss Heath Ledger.
I recently saw somebody who looked exactly like Heath Ledger, and I was like,
Still dead.
Still dead.
Yeah, I probably not in Vegas flipping burgers. No. I like Elvis. No.
Not quite that famous. Yeah.
But maybe compost.
Could be compost, although our burial practices in this country are horrendous.
They're changing them. No, but they're changing them. It's more and more like possible for you to put in your like end of life plans to say that you want to be buried in eco-friendly ways. But
although I thought he lived in Australia.
Yeah.
Although Australia loves that kind of thing too.
That's right.
Yeah. I know I've talked about green burials quite a bit. We learned about it in seminary, and then I've talked about it with my family of like, oh no, I don't want to be in a vault in a thing like pinewood box. Sounds great.
Right. I used to live on a farm, and up until pretty recently actually, and we would have we'd have to take the chickens out to if they died or if something happened or whatever, and we'd have to put them in a gully, and then their bodies would be consumed by a living animal, and we would have these morbid conversations occasionally where we'd be like, I mean, okay, so if something just happens on the farm, just put my body in the gully. Like, it's fine.
Actually, there are laws.
There are laws, and they're helpful laws. However.
And making sure that you don't, wind up getting mistaken for a murder victim is probably for the best.
Right.
But
that's right.
Conversations I have had with the police that I never expected to. Anyway, moving on.
I was going to say, we don't need anyone to actually be an episode of CSI.
Nope.
Right.
Yeah.
There's always...
we may love true crime podcasts, but we don't need to be on them.
That's right.
So.
That's right.
True. Speaking of true crimes, it's a crime how terrible Job's life is in our reading for today. But that's not even the part we're talking about. It was just a really bad segue.
It's a great segue.
Thanks. But in our first reading for this episode and for this Sunday, God is talking about, like, okay, Job, yeah, your friends are maybe wrong, but also, did you create everything? Have you created the whole cosmos? And so I particularly appreciate that in the context of what you were saying about the ways that we engage or disengage with creation care and the idea of loving neighbor, planet, and God, and that those are all connected, because I don't think we do a great job of naming. Not only is our neighbor the human, but as one of my friends, Pastor Nakira, says, it's the more than human creatures too. It's the whole planet, and that's part of loving our neighbors, but that's also part of loving God. And it's so good.
And on days when I have a slightly more bleak outlook on the human race, I decide maybe I'll just try to save the world for the cats.
That's right.
I can do that.
They'll eat you when you die.
Yes, but I'll be dead by then.
That's fine.
Solves, the gully problem.
Right. So we're in Vacation Bible School right now, and with the church that I'm a volunteer pastor with, and we just the elementary school kids were telling me about the creation story in Genesis, the first creation story, and I was quizzing them about like who gets created what day, and I said, what day did the humans get created? And they're like, oh, day 6. And then it was so hard and frustrating that then God had to rest. And I was like, you know what? That's some perfect theology. Like, so hard and frustrating. But then they were like, like God did all this other creating and then got to the humans. Like, God didn't start with the humans. God started with laying the foundations and laying all the beautiful waters above and below and all of that. And then got around to humans. Like, we're not the center. We're not the beginning. We're part, like, we get created on the 6th day. And, I always think, like, the story of Job is just really devastating, and I resonate with Job being real mad at God, and really appreciate that in our sacred texts we have this example of someone being mad at God. And I, for the life of me, I can't remember who reframed God's response to Job, that we can read God as being real mad at Job for being upset, right? But there's another way of, like, God answering Job out of the whirlwind and going, I mean, you try it. This is real hard. like, tell me if you understand how to do this, because this is hard. Not that God can't do it, but that God's like trying to explain, like, this is how complicated and complex, like, the world is. And and when I think about climate change and Job, like, we have made ourselves, like, we've tried to believe that we are like God, that we can do whatever we want with the world. And it turns out that, like, God can say, as Job says in the book of Job, like, God can say, this is the limit of creation, and creation listens. But humans can't say to creation, hey, like, don't get any hotter. And creation is like, sorry, you screwed up. And so now, and you have no control over us. And
maybe you shouldn't have burned down all the rainforest.
Yeah, like, maybe you shouldn't have done all of this, right? And so in some ways, I don't feel like it's God's, like, we can see it as God's indictment of Job whining, or we can hear God saying, this is really hard, and don't think you know what you're doing unless you do know what you're doing. And I think climate change is a reminder that we actually don't know what we're doing. And as a Presbyterian, as a Reformed Christian, like, climate change for me is a reminder that God is sovereign and we are not. And we thought that we were in control, but actually our thinking that we had dominion in a violent way actually meant that we lost control. Yeah.
Well, and, like, the one exception to that rule, right, is, in fact, Jesus. I'm so good at segues this time. This is actually a good segue, because you were talking about, like, humans can't tell the climate, stop.
That's right.
And, in fact, in today's gospel, Jesus falls asleep in a boat, and the disciples are afraid of the storm that comes. So they wake Jesus, and Jesus tells it to stop. But what I was really fascinated by when I was reading it in preparation of this episode was that the disciples say to Jesus, do you not care that we are perishing? And that question feels really fitting right now, particularly, like, thinking about all of the youth who are mobilizing around climate change and climate justice. And especially, like, with the very deadly weather events. Like, we had a derecho last year in Iowa, and everybody was like, what even is this?
Right.
Nobody knew what it was. It was literally a hurricane on land with, like, 10 minutes notice, never before happened.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think
Minnesota is getting tired of winter because we keep having polar vortexes. Minnesota.
Polar vortexes, too.
I live in Texas, and we had snowpocalypse this year. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel very clear that I should name my favorite explanation of how we know as humans that we're not in charge of the climate or the planet, and, like, we are not sovereign. God is over the world. And that is this. There was a 17-minute rain delay when the Chicago Cubs were in the World Series. If we were in control of the weather, there wouldn't have been a 17-minute weather delay while the Cubs were in the World Series after a long time, right? Like,
In Game 7.
in Game 7,
In
right?
Game
Like,
7, after, while breaking the goat curse.
right, like,
I don't usually care about baseball, but this was the one thing that made me care about baseball.
And, like, if we ever needed a reminder that we were not in charge of the weather, the Chicago Cubs should be reminding us of that. So
the Chicago Cubs are really a reminder of so many things we're not in charge of.
that's right. That is right. I think the disciples are asking a question that, as you say, Emily, that children and youth are asking, and about climate. And it reminds me of when the pandemic started. One of the leaders of the climate strikes movement, who's a young woman, wrote this beautiful op-ed about responding to climate change as a parallel to responding to the pandemic. And she said, people who are old and vulnerable are asking us to make huge life changes to protect them. And we should do it. And I'm a young person who's not vulnerable, and I'm making this choice to protect them, because that is what you do in a community. That's what you do in a world where we're connected. And what I'm asking in return is that people who are older than me take climate change seriously and make the lifestyle and cultural shifts that we need to make in order to save my life too. Mm-hmm. And it was the most, like, powerful, like, we should all care that we're all perishing. And we, like, when we're put to the test, we, like, really can do it. That we really can care about each other, most of us. Maybe not all, but most of us.
It's so much easier to do that one-on-one than in huge groups.
Yeah, or like to say we're only going to change our behavior for like 2 years is way easier than saying actually we need to change our whole culture forever and ever. Amen.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't want to go back to the way things were now. And like, admittedly, I live in Iowa, and that's a whole other ballgame when it comes to like the pandemic inaction. That we're like the control group of what happens if you don't actually do anything to stop a pandemic. But there are things that like we have done anyway. And it's so much easier to keep doing those big changes after you've already been doing them for a year.
Right, exactly. You know, and so like I've been thinking about like how, I mean, my job at Green Faith required me to fly all the time before the pandemic. And we had these long conversations all the time about like, how do we ethically like offset this? What do we need to be thinking about? Like, is it ethical for us to fly? And then there's this whole shift, right? That like people couldn't fly. And I mean, truly, I was flying for either my job or like the freelance work that I do at least 2 weekends a month, right? It was
Yikes.
And I had enough miles that I was getting upgraded to first class every time. Like that's how much I was flying. And I haven't been on a plane in almost a year. And have no intention of getting on a plane in the next 5 months, right? And that is a thing that I just have begun to think about. Like, okay, what if I get on a plane once a year? Like that's the big change that is actually what I'm taking from that. And flying, does flying affect climate? There's lots of conversation about that, and it's kind of connected to personal choice versus cultural shifts. And yeah, it requires me to be more local in my work. And it turns out that I really like being stuck in one place.
And we're also doing this podcast from 3 different states.
Yep.
I also just we also all have our videos on, so that we can see each other, though we're not recording the video, right? Like we're only recording the sound. And I just heard from Bill McKibben, I was interviewing him for my dissertation. I don't really mean to name drop, but I'm name dropping him.
That's okay, because I don't know who that is anyway.
Great. People don't know who he is. But Bill McKibben was he wrote the first popularly available book on climate change.
Oh.
And was one of the people to start the divestment from fossil fuels campaign in the world. And so I was interviewing him for my dissertation on Zoom, and he said, "It's really good to see you, blah, blah, blah. Also, I'm turning my video off because I just recently learned that most of the problem when you're recording a Zoom, most of the carbon emissions from a Zoom call that's recorded is from video." And I was like, oh, then I guess I'm turning my video off. And yeah, so it just reminded me that okay, we got to be constantly willing to learn a new thing and change and grow and be open to that. But I'm also finding myself wanting to come back to this question about the disciples saying, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And I think there's a theodicy question in that.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Both in the local, hey, Jesus, you're our buddy. Why are you going to let us die? But also this now in climate.
Can you explain what theodicy is?
Yep.
Because I don't know if everybody, that's one of those fancy theology.
Fancy, yes. So theodicy is about why there's suffering in the world and why God lets that happen. And it often is connected to this dilemma of, can God be all powerful, all good, and all loving if there's real suffering in the world? And so how do we describe who God is? And so this is a question about suffering, right? For these really the small band of disciples. But when we think about climate change and environmental injustice and it can be a theodicy question. Do we say to God, we need you to step in and fix climate change because we can't do it apparently? But it is also a question for us as we think about we know that climate change historically and environmental injustice historically has impacted people of color, people who are poor, women, children, people who are old, first and worst. And the same kind of people that Jesus put at the center of his ministry are the people who are affected by climate change first and worst. And I think there's a lot of it's very bold of us to think, oh God, why are you letting us perish? When I feel like Jesus would look at us and be like, why are you letting each other perish? You know what the greatest
perish.
Right.
Yeah.
You know what the greatest commandment is. And you're failing at that. of course I care. And of course my heart is breaking. And maybe you shouldn't have whipped up the storm. And of course, like, in the story in Mark, right, like, the disciples didn't cause the storm that they're in. But now we're like... Probably not. I mean, we don't know.
Yeah.
But we now are living in storms that we created. And God still hears us when we cry out and say, God, help us, right? And I still think God looks back at us and says, hey, you know what to do. I'm with you. I'm going to help you figure it out. Mostly just keep telling you to love each other and stop hurting my planet. But it's you. It's you. It's your job to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I also feel really convicted when Jesus is saying, why are you afraid? Because I, like, spend every day thinking about climate change. Literally, every day. And because I do that, I'm terrified every day. Because scientists have said that we have either no time or very little time to turn the ship, right? And I think at this point, that's, like, the right emotion, is to be terrified. And that terror combined with our faith makes it possible to organize as people of faith, to push back on policies and powers and industries that contribute to the destruction of the planet and the destruction of life. Yeah. I think our terror and our faith is what could save us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. On that note, Abby, do you believe that corporations and or the super rich might have a special role to play in all this work?
Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. Like, those of us with great power have great responsibility.
Spider-Man.
That's right. That's like
It's actually biblical.
Well, yes, okay, but we are many kinds of nerds.
But also Spider-Man is always what I think of, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But, like, that's it, right? And also, like, if you're trying to dismantle any kind of injustice, it's those of us who are with power, right, are the ones that really have that responsibility. And there are companies and industries that have have contributed to climate change more than individuals, right?
Well, there are a couple of individuals who keep trying to go into space. Not that I'm thinking of anyone in
particular. Right,
sorry.
And, like... And, like, why the hell are those people, like, trying to go into space when they could, I don't know, be putting that money into, like, creating infrastructures, like solar panels all around the world, right? Like, don't take us off of this planet. Like, put your resources to save this one, right? And
and then once we fix this one, then we can get off of this planet and go explore.
Maybe, right? But, like, let's get our together here.
Well, and let's be clear, like, there's a very big difference between, like, NASA and, like, scientists trying to go to outer space and trying to go to Mars and those sorts of things, and like, learning. Bezos and Musk, who just want to, like, go for fun.
Right.
To do this cool new thing.
Mm-hmm.
And have a mansion in the sky.
Yeah. No, and, like, there's a billionaire from, I don't remember what country, somewhere in Asia, who, like, won a bid to go up in SpaceX, and he is literally going to do some science experiments about physics and farting. And I was like, on the one hand, if the 12-year-old boy inside of me is laughing hysterically, and the 35-year-old climate justice activist is real pissed. Because could you...
I mean, if anyone should get to do those experiments, I think some, actual astronauts, for goodness sakes, let them have some time off while they're up there and do something fun.
But, like, the individuals who have this massive wealth, they should be using that wealth for good. But, I mean, also, the work that I do is around divestment from fossil fuels, and all of us who are connected to, faith institutions have access to wealth in the U.S. and can leverage our financial power, whatever size, to push back on corporations and industries like the fossil fuel industry, and to claim the power that we do have, right? Not all of us are billionaires, but Presbyterians, if you're a Presbyterian, you have access to...
Y'all have, like...
We have billions of dollars, and not, a very small percentage of those billions of dollars are in fossil fuels, but we could divest all of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Lutherans could be divesting from fossil fuels and saying, hey, we're an institution too. We're a faith industry, and we're going to pit our industry against yours and claim our moral authority that says we don't invest in things that harm other people, and we care that people are perishing. And I long for the day when all people of faith are like, I'm not going to profit off for other parts of God's good creation perishing.
Yeah. Amen.
And us divesting doesn't let the fossil fuel industry off the hook. Like, us doing good doesn't mean that
Yes.
the fossil fuel industry gets to keep doing what they've been doing. They need to stop. You need to stop.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's, NPR did a story the other day about, like, I think it was maybe BP, but a couple different companies, like, people got their environmental justice organizations got their people on the board. Not, like, the majority of the board, but got, like, by proxy votes and stuff.
Mm-hmm. That's
2
excellent.
or 3 people on the board and it, like, happened in a couple different places that, like, they either did that or they made, like, other big shifts and stuff, which is, I was impressed with. And
it's also taken decades to have that shift happen.
Yeah.
And, yeah. So, like, I want to be like, good job, Exxon, and the other part of me is like, dick.
Right, and, like, it wasn't that Exxon wanted that, right? Like, it was that the organizations, the environmental justice organizations, did all of this work, and by then it was too late for Exxon to stop them. Right? Like, this was not Exxon trying to do this good thing. It was, Exxon thought it wasn't a big deal until too late. Didn't realize the power that people had to organize.
Yeah. That's right. The more we talk about these conversations, the more that these conversations with the fossil fuel companies are reminding me of my conversations with my parents back in the day trying to convince them to quit smoking. Just the parallels are astonishing. Of you're literally going to die. I don't know what you think you're going to get out of that, but
yeah, you're literally going to die.
Yeah, I mean, we're all going to die, probably. I assume, unless really weird things happen, but maybe not like that.
Yeah.
Also, this is not a fair question because I totally should have Googled this beforehand, but it didn't occur to me until after we had already started recording. Abby, did your Green Faith group or another group that you're familiar with have anything to do with, what was it called? The Green Bible? The Bible about creation, where all of the verses about creation were highlighted in green?
Yeah.
That happened a few years back?
So the Green Bible is no longer in print. So there's a movement to, like, get it redone. Though many of my colleagues and mentors have also argued that the entire Bible should be green. Like, like when they reprint it,
literally,
like it's like it's all green. So the answer is I don't think Green Faith had anything to do with getting that into the world. But now I want to go look at my copy of it and go, is my gloss in here? I kind of just want to text him and be like, hey, did you do the thing? Yeah, that's the answer. What I thought you were going to ask was about the Line 3 protests that just were happening.
Yeah.
That the water protectors in northern Minnesota just called for solidarity action to stand against Enbridge, which is a Canadian oil company. And the Indigenous leaders have been fighting Enbridge for many years, and they just asked for people of faith and people around the country to come and meet in Minnesota, and Green Faith was one of the organizers of the multi-faith delegation.
Great.
That said, hey, 1, we listen to Indigenous people, and 2, no more fossil fuels. We gotta stop.
Yeah.
And so that's what I thought you were gonna ask about. And I think that's really a part of, like, what we as people of faith are called to do in this day and age. Say to industries that are evil, you don't get to kill anybody else.
Yeah. You're done killing people. Especially because it is, like you said, so much of it is in our name. Whether it's us as people in this country or as people of faith, as Protestants. Yeah, I think about that. And the tactics that they used, I think it was Monday, they flew a helicopter really low above the protesters to kick up all of the dirt and stuff. And thinking about the connection between the tactics that police are taught, right? So in Des Moines, we've been pushing back against the de-escalation trainers that they picked because they're people who have excessive force violations. We've been pushing back to that. So they just announced, we're using this third-party organization. A quick Google during a city council meeting showed that third-party organization trained the police at Standing Rock. And so it's like those pieces where I think it's easy for particularly, like, white moderate people to be like, oh, well, you can be, and I think there's a lot of environmental justice that is, like, predominantly white in ways that are really problematic, but there's also a really clear connection between the activism and the work of water protectors and of people who are of Indigenous people who are protecting the land, and the brutality that they face and the brutality that BLM protesters face, and all of those connections.
Yeah. I would also, on a lighter note, just like to take a moment and say that the company in Canada is named Embridge and not Umbridge.
Yep.
Yes. Although,
just in case anyone else made that connection.
Many similarities between the professor.
Oddly enough.
Uh-huh. Pretty awful. Yeah.
So, Abby, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Well, if you want to do one thing today when you're listening to this podcast, one thing today to make a difference around climate change, you should be calling or writing to President Biden to tell him to revoke the permit on Line 3, which is that pipeline that Indigenous people have been organizing around and protecting the water around for many years. So that's one thing that you can do as a person of faith or as a human in the world to do that. And then the other thing is I really just want to bring us back to composting as a spiritual practice. And
I am so glad you joined us today. I just want to say
that we're not going to change the world by composting, but we are going to change our own individual, how we interact with the world and what we see as valuable. That has value.
It's like prayer.
It is like prayer. And it reminds us that life is a cycle and is all connected. So I'll be thinking about that for a while.
Thanks for joining us. It was good to have
thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Our first reading is from Job chapter 38, verses 1 through 11. After Job's friends have totally missed the point of the reason for his suffering, God enters the conversation at the end of the book. God begins by inviting them to consider the majesty and astonishing scope of God's creation.
One of the things that I noticed in this passage that I kind of mentioned a little bit in our conversation with Abby was the way that God is could be construed as taking on Job and being like, Job, listen up. But it also, as Abby pointed out, it could be okay, but have you tried this? This is hard.
And come to think of it, the thought of God yelling at Job means that God would see Job as a threat, which I find unlikely.
That is also true. But what I really thought of as I was reading the passage was all of those YouTube rap battles. God going at it with Job in a rap battle of but did you do this and this and this and this? And yeah.
Don't get into a rap battle with God. You're not going to win. I mean, Jesus was also really good at this.
Yeah. Not a winning battle for you.
When we reach verse 5, we read, "Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it?" And by it, we mean creation. God is asking. And planning out the measurements for something often means that you get to determine how it fulfills its purpose. And this made me think of the show Babylon 5. And at one point, someone who's not from Earth, Delenn, said that of all the races in the known universe, only humans would come up with the idea of making a space station, specifically so that many different races could come together and live in community on it. Part of the exact quote is, "Humans share one unique quality. They build communities. It is a great gift and a terrible responsibility, one that cannot be abandoned." And so, having built the space station and determined its measurements, you might say, they forge ahead with trying to build this community, and that goes well sometimes and badly other times and really badly occasionally. But that's basically the journey of the show.
Yes. I haven't seen Babylon, but yeah, we do have a propensity
enjoyed the first 4
community.
seasons. Yeah.
I was looking at verses 6 and 7 where we read, "On what were creation's bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy." And I love the poetic nature of this particular depiction of creation.
Oh, it's gorgeous. Yeah.
And it reminded me actually of this article that my college roommate sent me the other day about dark matter, and there's a new theory coming out about what dark matter is, and that it might be actually a particle in another dimension, and I cannot explain it, but we'll link to it in the episode description. But just this okay, you think that this is what it is, but then what if it there's this whole we just look at the sky and there are stars and there are pinpricks, and Pumbaa is of course right that they're burning balls of gas, but then to like think about all of the more complexities that we don't even see, that's beyond our scope. And that's kind of what God is doing in painting this picture.
Also, when we read verse 9, we find, "When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band." And this immediately reminded me of the Star Trek The Original Series episode called The Cloud Minders, which the short version is basically, it's about exploiting both the environment and people. The 1960s version of social justice that they were trying to put in it is that the women lived in the clouds and were like happy and basically rich, and they made the men go down to the surface and do mining and basically destroy themselves. And for the 1960s, that was actually pretty progressive. And then they learned about the importance of like caring about other people, which is something we still haven't figured out, so fair. And also, let's not actually destroy the planet, even if we do live in the clouds, because that is probably not going to end well. So,
yeah, I imagine we could use, Venus as an example. Venus used to have a temperature like Earth. Venus does not anymore. I don't imagine the clouds are particularly comfortable.
Probably not. I don't know that, there's a race of people on Venus whose fault that is, but I guess we'll find out one day. If we live that long.
Also true. And then in verse 11, God says, in this ongoing questioning of Job of, did you do this? Did you say this? God asks, did you say, thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud waves be stopped? Speaking of talking to the waters. And of course, that reminded me of a dear quote from Lord of the Rings of Gandalf to the Balrog being like, you shall not pass.
Now I really want the version of this conversation between Job and God where Gandalf is also there.
And
I can only imagine how that would...
Yes, in fact. I did say that, but I said it to the fire instead of the water. You get the water, I'll get the fire. Somebody else can get the wind and the earth.
I feel like Gandalf would wind up yelling at both of them. Or possibly just, sitting back and having a smoke and not caring about any of it. That could go either way.
Just creating, smoke boats that, float around them all. Our second reading for this episode is 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. Paul declares that God's love and grace is always with us, even and especially when we least expect it, during the worst time, and that God never rejects us.
Yay.
Yes. Yay, God never rejects us.
Also, yay, Paul is, actually being kind of positive for a change.
What?
I like to celebrate those moments. It does happen.
That's fair. Yeah. Occasionally, Paul. Not bad. Occasionally. So one of the themes in this passage that I noticed was unsurprising to basically everyone is hashtag false binaries. So it comes up a bunch where Paul is positing binaries that aren't actually really solid.
False dichotomies?
Yeah. But that they are and aren't oxymorons. And
it's a spectrum.
Yeah. It's more complicated.
Strangely enough.
I know. So it reminded me of Firefly, both the TV show and I have the game Firefly, and it's really explicit in the game Firefly. But so often in the U.S., people talk about something, and if it's legal, it's moral, and if it's illegal, it's immoral. And I think, right? And so I think what we're talking about with Abby, right, of the stuff that people are doing to the environment is legal, that doesn't make it moral. But that there's that dichotomy of the false dichotomy of legal versus immoral. And it's actually no, something can be legal and immoral. Something can be illegal and moral. And I think the crew on Firefly, try to navigate that pretty well, because they are generally moral characters. And so navigate legality in a very fluid way, but then have a lot of struggles when it comes to more immoral things that they're asked to do.
Yeah.
And then diving into the verses, there's this chunk, verses 4 through 8, where Paul says, "But as servants of God, we have commended ourselves in every way, through great endurance, in afflictions, hardships, calamities, beatings, imprisonments, riots, labors, sleepless nights, hunger, by purity, knowledge, patience, kindness, holiness of spirit, genuine love, truthful speech, and the power of God with the weapons of righteousness for the right hand and for the left, in honor and dishonor, in ill repute, good repute. We are treated as imposters and yet are true. So that's a lot.
Yeah. But also it's kind of hard to break up.
It is kind of hard to break up. So I was thinking about like every activism ever, right? Like all activists like can read this list and be like, ooh, done that, done that, done that, done that. And there's the like reality of part of activism is trying to reveal the truth. And so the idea that hiding the truth is a bad thing, which connects with like activism, but also connects with like Divergent, where like in a lot of young adult plots, particularly Divergent, there's like something that is hidden. There is a truth that is not being shared, and that leads to all of these problems because only some people know, and only some of those people are trustworthy with it, and all sorts of problems.
Yeah, see, and I've read those exact same verses, and at about the halfway point where it stops listing the stuff that just, sucked, and starts listing the good stuff, where he sort of makes a left-hand turn there, I think of Firefly, oddly enough. And I think of Jane's speech to the Mutters when Jane is a mercenary with very few morals or scruples, and he is, for a long list of reasons, put into the awkward position of making an inspiring speech to a crowd of people, which is really not his forte at all. Like, he is so unhappy to be there, but he also realizes he has to do it. And he realizes partway through his speech, where he is going into the list of why these people's lives are terrible, and that is a very long list, that he is going to have to stop talking about how terrible all this stuff is and have to say something good, something inspiring, something positive. And what he winds up coming up with, because there's nothing else he can say, is basically they got handed the shortest end of the stick anyone ever had, but, well, you took it. And that's what he can come up with. And the weird thing is it actually kind of works, because he's talking about their determination, and and that is something that they are already proud of. But it's the world's worst inspiring speech. But also, like, sometimes that's what you've got, So.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And then in the next verse, in verse 9, Paul writes, as unknown and yet are well known, as dying and see we are alive, as punished and yet not killed. And it actually, like, made me think of The Giver, because I think I'm right on this, but in The Giver, they have, like, I forget what they call it, but it's the thing where they, like, basically kill people, but it's, like, not called that, and they, like, give them this shot that kills them.
Released. They're released.
Yeah. So when they release people, and actually, like, everybody who does that is, like, really smiley, because they're, like, all drugged and all of those things, but, like, they're super smiley. They, like, don't think of it as, like, a painful thing, even though objectively, like, on the video, it is a painful thing. And so, yeah, when people die, they're, like, super smiley. And so this, I was just, like, as I was reading this, I was like, dying and yet alive, punished, and, like...
Yeah.
Are y'all okay?
Yeah. I'm not dead yet. To take it a slightly different direction. Actually, I was going to jump to verse 11. We have spoken frankly to you, Corinthians. Our heart is wide open to you. And I am still working on Shannon McGuire's October Day series of books, and there is a scene in one of the later books, and I know that these books came out a while ago, but I'm choosing not to spoil because I just got to this part, So this is about me more than our listeners. But there is a scene in one of the later books where a declaration of love is made because they think they're really about to die, and to not have said it would be a regret, and they don't do regrets. And I thought that was lovely, and how rare and difficult it is for so many of us to be open and frank about who we love, and isn't that wonderful? Yeah. Although probably, maybe don't wait until you think you're about to die, if at all possible, but still, there were extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, maybe a little sooner.
Yeah. Our gospel reading for today is Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Jesus naps on a boat with his disciples. When a bad storm comes up, they wake him terrified, and he calms the storm for them, inviting them to a deeper faith.
So one of the themes in this passage is environmental harm. So as we talked about, I know, some with Abby, the harm that is caused by the environment, but also to the environment by people. And admittedly, as Abby pointed out, like, the disciples are not the ones, like, causing the storm, but they are terrified of the storm, and the storm is causing them distress, if not harm.
Yeah.
And so it did get me thinking about, like, basically all of the, like, movies about the future, especially, are all, like, dystopias where the earth has been destroyed in some environmental capacity, right? Like, there's, like, radiation everywhere, the water's flooded everywhere, or whatever. Like, those are every movie about the future. If it's not an asteroid coming to destroy Earth, it's that humans have devastated the Earth in some capacity, including,
See, I think it's interesting
Wall-E.
that you say that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that you say that because I grew up watching Star Trek. I grew
Mm-hmm.
up watching a show that was 100% about, of course we're going to fix the environment. Of course we're going to make it
Mm-hmm.
okay. Of course we're going to make it so that there is no poverty, at least on Earth, and working on it everywhere else. So, yeah.
Yeah. When we dive into the verses, verse 36, we read that they leave the crowd behind and took Jesus with them. The disciples leave the crowd behind and take Jesus with them in the boat, just as he was, and other boats were with him. And it made me think, I just started Winterkeep, which is the 4th book in the Graceling realm by Kristen Kishore, which just came out.
Oh, yes, you were looking forward to that.
Yeah, so I finally finished Bitter Blue in my rereads and then just started Winterkeep. And it starts with, like, this suspicious sinking of a boat, of a ship. And so I don't know, like, what's behind it or why it happened or anything, except that it is, I'm, like, 3 chapters in, so it's not spoilers, but that it's suspicious. And so then the question becomes, like, was it the weather? Was it the Keeper, which is this, like, sentient underwater creature monster? Or was it human? Who knows? My bet is on humans because there's some sort of fuel that is making it a suspicious sinking. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'm excited to figure it out.
Sure.
And then in the next verse, in verse 37, we hear of the great gale that arose and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. And that reminded me of Laia and the Nightbringer in the Ember and the Ashes series and the Sky Against the Storm. But the great waves of suffering, particularly that the Nightbringer experiences and then unleashes, and then are unleashed on the whole of creation and everyone. And just that sense of, I think it's really easy to think of storms and stories about storms in the Bible as also, like, stories of grief. That it can be so easy to be overwhelmed by the great gale and the wave.
Yeah. And on an unusual note to finish us off for this episode, I actually had 2 contrasting thoughts about one verse. So I'm talking about verse 41, and I took this 2 rather different ways. And they were filled with great awe, and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and sea obey him?" So on the one hand, my first reaction was, guys, you've been traveling with this guy for a while now. Like, I mean, I realize that this is Mark and it's still kind of early and Mark moves very fast, but still, you've been traveling with Jesus for a while now. You should be able to answer at least the basics of this question. But no. Or possibly it reminds me of the ongoing bit in the musical Hamilton, where every time that he says something extraordinary in a new crowd, the immediate response is, "Who is this?" Even if he's literally just been introduced.
I mean, to be fair, the disciples get worse and worse as the Gospel of Mark goes along.
That's true.
Yeah.
Or my exact opposite reaction of that was to answer the question of who is this, which is to say, so does this mean that Jesus is Aquaman? And does that mean that one day we're going to have a version of Jesus played by Jason Momoa? Because I'm actually up for that. Because A, not white, and B, definitely has the facial hair and the hair.
Automatically more accurate than most movie depictions of Jesus so far. So
yeah,
go for it. Good.
Also, I think he can do the snark. Like, I think the snarky side of Jesus has not really been properly portrayed yet.
That's true, and it's real good in Mark.
Yeah.
Mark has some snarky Jesus.
Mark.
Snarky Marky. I know, it's like snarky Marky Jesus. What? Yeah. Mark has got the snarky Jesus. There we go.
Absolutely. Which, let's be honest, that's our favorite. We all know that.
True. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 5th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Roloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at NERDSATCHURCH, Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our full guest episodes and interviews, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. We hope Patreon can help us get our episodes transcribed for those who need or prefer that, though if you want to help us with transcripts, let us know via email or social media. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.